Racist man kicks black woman off plane, instantly regrets it when her status is revealed. Ava Thompson's fingers drummed a silent rhythm on her leather briefcase as she strode through the bustling airport terminal. The click of her heels on the polished floor echoed her determination, each step a testament to the years she'd spent climbing the corporate ladder. Today was supposed to be just another business trip, a quick jaunt to close a deal that would cement her company's position in the market. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As she approached the first-class check-in counter, Ava couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Eyes lingered a fraction too long. Expressions flickered between curiosity and something less pleasant. She was used to it by now, the unspoken questions, the assumptions. With a practiced smile, she handed over her ID and boarding pass to the attendant, whose professional demeanor didn't waver. "Everything seems to be in order, Miss Thompson," the attendant said, returning her documents. "Have a pleasant flight." Ava nodded her thanks and made her way to the priority security line. As she waited, her mind drifted to the upcoming meeting. She mentally rehearsed her presentation, envisioning the boardroom, the faces of potential partners. This deal could change everything, not just for her company, but for the communities they aim to support through their philanthropic initiatives. Security was a breeze, as always. Ava had perfected the art of efficient travel, her carry-on packed with precision, her movements through the checkpoint smooth and practiced. As she gathered her belongings on the other side, she caught sight of her reflection in a nearby window. The tailored suit hugged her curves, projecting an image of success and confidence. She adjusted her collar slightly, then continued on her way. The first-class lounge welcomed her with its familiar hush of exclusivity. Ava settled into a plush armchair, pulling out her tablet to review some last-minute figures. Around her, other travelers engaged in hushed conversations or tapped away at laptops. A waiter approached, offering a selection of premium beverages. "Just water, please," Ava said with a smile. Still, as she sipped her water, Ava's gaze wandered around the lounge. That's when she first noticed him, a middle-aged man in an expensive jacket, his designer glasses perched on a nose that seemed perpetually turned up. He was staring at her, his expression a mix of confusion and disdain. Ava met his gaze coolly, refusing to be intimidated. After a moment, the man looked away, muttering something to his companion. Ava returned to her work, but she could feel the weight of the man's gaze returning to her periodically. She'd encountered this type before, people who couldn't reconcile her presence in spaces they considered their exclusive domain. With a small sigh, she closed her tablet. It was almost time to board anyway. As she approached the gate, Ava noticed the man from the lounge standing near the priority boarding line. His eyes narrowed as she took her place in the queue. Ava straightened her spine, chin lifted slightly. She belonged here as much as anyone else, and no amount of sideways glances could change that fact. The boarding process began, and Ava made her way down the jet bridge. As she stepped onto the plane, the familiar scent of leather and filtered air greeted her. A flight attendant directed her to her seat in the first-class cabin. Ava stowed her carry-on in the overhead compartment with practiced ease, then settled into her spacious seat. She had just pulled out her book when she heard him, the man from the lounge, his voice carrying clearly despite his attempt at a whisper. "This is exactly why I hate flying nowadays," he grumbled to his seatmate. "They just let anyone into first class." Ava's grip on her book tightened imperceptibly, but her face remained impassive. She'd learned long ago that reacting only gave people like him more power. Instead, she opened her book, losing herself in the words as the cabin continued to fill around her. The tension in the air was palpable, a live wire waiting for a spark. Ava could feel it building, knew that this flight was about to become anything but routine. As the last passengers trickled in and the doors were prepared for closure, she heard the man's voice again, louder this time, laced with barely contained anger. "Excuse me," he barked at a nearby flight attendant. "I need to talk to someone. Right now." Ava's eyes remained fixed on her book, but her senses were on high alert. She'd faced discrimination before, had stared it down in boardrooms and on city streets. But here, in the confined space of an airplane, about to hurtle through the sky at hundreds of miles per hour, the situation felt more volatile, more unpredictable. As the flight attendant approached the man, Ava took a deep breath, centering herself. Whatever was about to unfold, she would face it with the same grace and strength that had carried her through countless challenges before. The real test, she realized, was about to begin. Not in a boardroom, but right here in the first-class cabin of a plane that hadn't even left the ground. The young flight attendant, her name tag reading Emily, approached the agitated passenger with a practiced smile. Her eyes darted briefly to Ava, who remained focused on her book, before addressing the man. "How can I help you, sir?" Emily asked, her voice steady despite the tension radiating from the passenger. The man, whose expensive jacket and designer glasses spoke of wealth and privilege, didn't bother to lower his voice. "There's been a mistake," he hissed, gesturing toward Ava's seat. "She shouldn't be sitting in first class." Emily blinked, momentarily taken aback by the directness of his accusation. She glanced again at Ava, who appeared engrossed in her reading, though her grip on the book had tightened imperceptibly. "I'm sorry, sir," Emily began, choosing her words carefully, "but I'm not sure I understand. Can you explain what you mean?" The man's face flushed with irritation, his voice rising. "Look, I don't know how she got here, but this section is for paying customers, for people who actually belong here." He emphasized the word belong with a sneer, his meaning unmistakable. "I've paid too much money to deal with this nonsense." His words hung in the air, sharp and laden with prejudice. A few nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pretending not to hear while others watched the unfolding scene with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Emily's professional demeanor wavered for a moment as she struggled to find an appropriate response. Ava, meanwhile, kept her eyes fixed on her book, though she hadn't turned a page in minutes. She'd been in situations like this before, where her mere presence seemed to challenge certain people's ideas of who belonged, in spaces like first class. Each word from the man behind her stung like a physical blow, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Emily, visibly uncomfortable now, glanced between Ava and the irate passenger. "Sir, I assure you that all passengers in this cabin have valid first-class tickets," she said, trying to defuse the situation. But the man was not to be placated. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that carried clearly through the cabin. "I'll need to check her boarding pass," he insisted, his tone dripping with impatience and barely veiled contempt. "It's obvious she doesn't belong here." At this, Ava finally looked up from her book. Her eyes met Emily's, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. Emily saw in Ava's gaze a weariness that spoke of countless similar encounters, a strength born from facing down prejudice time and time again. Ava saw in Emily's eyes a mixture of apology and uncertainty, a young woman caught between protocol and moral outrage. With a slight nod, Ava closed her book and reached for her bag. The cabin had grown quiet, the other passengers now openly watching the drama unfold. Emily took a hesitant step towards Ava, her discomfort evident in every movement. "Ma'am," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm very sorry to disturb you, but may I please check your boarding pass?" Ava's movements were deliberate as she retrieved her boarding pass and handed it to Emily. Her face remained impassive, but her eyes held a quiet dignity that seemed to fill the cabin. Emily quickly scanned the ticket, her eyes widening slightly as she saw not only the confirmation of Ava's first-class seat, but also a notation indicating her status as a VIP passenger. "Thank you, ma'am," Emily said, returning the pass with an apologetic look. "Everything is in order." She turned back to the man, who was now half-standing, craning his neck to see the interaction. "Sir, I can confirm that this passenger is correctly seated in first class." But the man was not satisfied. His face contorted with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "That can't be right," he sputtered, his voice rising even further. "People like her don't fly first class." The words hung in the air, sharp and unmistakably racist. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin, followed by a tense silence. Phones appeared in hands, some passengers discreetly beginning to record the unfolding situation. Emily's face paled, her professional mask slipping to reveal shock and dismay. Ava slowly stood, turning to face the man for the first time. Her movements were calm, controlled, but there was a fire in her eyes that spoke volumes. "Excuse me," she said, her voice low but clear, carrying easily in the hushed cabin. "What exactly do you mean by people like me?" The man, momentarily taken aback by Ava's direct confrontation, quickly recovered his bluster. "You know exactly what I mean," he sneered. "This isn't your place. You don't belong here." Ava's response was measured, her words carefully chosen. "I assure you, sir, that I am exactly where I belong. My ticket, my right to be here, and my humanity are not up for debate." The tension in the cabin was palpable. Other passengers began to murmur, some in support of Ava, others simply expressing their discomfort with the situation. Emily looked desperately around, clearly out of her depth and unsure how to proceed. It was at this moment that the head steward appeared, alerted by the commotion. Close behind him was the captain, his presence immediately commanding attention. The captain, an older man with salt and pepper hair and the bearing of someone used to handling difficult situations, quickly assessed the scene before him. "What seems to be the problem here?" the captain asked, his voice calm but authoritative. The man, emboldened by the growing audience and the arrival of the senior crew members, pointed accusingly at Ava. "I'm just trying to ensure a pleasant flight for everyone," he said, his tone self-righteous. "Clearly, there's been a mistake with her seating arrangement." The captain's eyes narrowed slightly as he turned to Emily, who quickly handed him Ava's boarding pass. He glanced at it, then looked up at Ava, his expression shifting to one of recognition and respect. Turning back to the man, the captain's voice took on a steely edge. "Sir, there is no mistake. Miss Thompson is exactly where she belongs." But the man, too wrapped up in his own entitlement to notice the shift in the captain's tone, pressed on. "Then maybe you need to reassess who you're letting sit in first class," he spat. The captain's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Ava spoke up. Her voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of steel that commanded attention. "Perhaps," she said, meeting the man's gaze steadily, "it's not me who needs to justify their presence here." The cabin fell silent, all eyes now fixed on Ava. In that moment, it was clear to everyone present that they were witnessing something significant, a woman standing her ground against blatant discrimination, refusing to be cowed or diminished. The captain, sensing the need to regain control of the situation, turned to address Ava directly. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin, "I want to personally apologize for this disruption. I assure you, this is not representative of our airline's values or the experience we strive to provide our passengers." Ava nodded, acknowledging the captain's words. Then, with a slight smile that held no humor, she delivered the final blow. "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate your intervention. I didn't expect this kind of treatment on a flight operated by an airline where I'm one of the major investors." The revelation hit like a thunderclap, sending shockwaves through the cabin. The man's face drained of color as the full weight of Ava's words sank in. Other passengers exchanged wide-eyed looks, some unable to suppress smiles at the poetic justice unfolding before them. In a single sentence, Ava had not only asserted her right to be there, but had completely upended the power dynamic. As the implications of Ava's statement settled over the cabin, it was clear that this flight, and perhaps the broader conversation about prejudice and belonging, was about to take an unexpected turn. The cabin seemed to hold its collective breath as Ava's words hung in the air. The revelation that she was a major investor in the airline had shifted the atmosphere dramatically. The captain, his eyes widening slightly in recognition, straightened his posture even further. "Miss Thompson," he said, his tone now laced with deep respect, "I had no idea. Please accept my sincerest apologies for this entire situation." Ava nodded graciously, but her eyes remained fixed on the man who had started this confrontation. He sat frozen in his seat, his face a mask of shock and dawning horror. The realization of who he had been berating and the potential consequences of his actions were clearly sinking in. I didn't know," the man stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating in an instant. He looked around the cabin, as if seeking support or escape, but found only disapproving stares and the unblinking lenses of phones recording the incident. Ava's voice, when she spoke, was calm but carried an undercurrent of steel that held everyone's attention. Knowledge of who I am shouldn't be necessary for you to treat me, or anyone else, with basic human dignity and respect. A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. Several passengers nodded approvingly, while others cast scathing looks at the man who had caused such a disturbance. The atmosphere had shifted palpably. What had started as one man's racist outburst had become a moment of collective reckoning. Emily, the young flight attendant who had been caught in the middle of the confrontation, stepped forward. Her voice shook slightly, but her words were clear. "Miss Thompson is right," she said, addressing not just the man, but the entire cabin. "Our policy is to treat all passengers with equal respect, regardless of their status or background." The captain nodded in agreement. "Well said, Emily." He turned back to the man, his expression now stern. "Sir, your behavior is unacceptable. It goes against everything our airline stands for, and it will not be tolerated." The man, seeming to finally grasp the gravity of the situation, attempted to backpedal. I'm sorry," he sputtered, his words directed more to the captain than to Ava. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble. Perhaps we can just forget this whole thing and have a pleasant flight?" But it was clear from the expressions of those around him that forgetting was not an option. The incident had struck a chord, bringing to the surface issues of racism and privilege that often simmered beneath the veneer of polite society. The cabin buzzed with tension, a powder keg of emotions waiting to explode. Ava, still standing, turned to address the entire cabin. Her voice was steady, her words measured but powerful. "What happened here today is not an isolated incident. It's a reflection of a larger problem that persists in our society. But it's also an opportunity for us to do better, to be better." A ripple of agreement passed through the passengers. Some nodded solemnly, while others leaned forward, hanging on Ava's every word. Even those who had initially seemed uncomfortable with the confrontation were now listening intently. "I've worked hard to get where I am," Ava continued. "I've faced obstacles and prejudices at every turn, but I've persevered, not just for myself, but for everyone who has been told they don't belong. Every time we challenge these assumptions, we create space for others to follow." The man, shrinking further into his seat with each word, attempted one last feeble defense. "I didn't mean any harm," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I was just concerned about the quality of the flight." Ava's gaze snapped back to him, her eyes blazing with a quiet fury. "The quality of this flight," she said, her voice low but clear, "was compromised the moment you decided to question my right to be here based on nothing but your own prejudices." The captain, who had been listening intently, stepped forward again. His face was grim, his decision clearly made. "Sir," he said, addressing the man directly, "I'm afraid we can't allow you to remain on this flight. Your behavior has created a hostile environment, and we have a responsibility to ensure the comfort and safety of all our passengers." A collective gasp went through the cabin, followed by a smattering of applause. The man's face drained of color as the reality of the situation sank in. "You can't be serious," he sputtered, looking around wildly. "You're kicking me off the plane? Do you know who I am?" The irony of his words was not lost on anyone. A few passengers chuckled darkly, while others shook their heads in disbelief at his continued arrogance. The captain remained unmoved. "Your identity is irrelevant, sir. Your actions have spoken loudly enough. I'm going to have to ask you to gather your belongings and exit the aircraft." As the realization of his impending removal set in, the man's demeanor shifted from indignation to panic. "Wait, please," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I'll apologize. I'll change seats. Anything, just don't make me leave." But it was too late. The decision had been made, and the wheels of consequence were already in motion. Two security officers, summoned by the flight crew, appeared at the entrance of the first-class cabin. Their presence added a new layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere. "Ava," still standing tall, watched the scene unfold with a mix of emotions playing across her face. There was vindication, yes, but also a deep weariness. This victory, hard-won as it was just one battle in a much larger war against prejudice and discrimination. As the security officers approached, the man made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. He turned to Ava, his face a mask of contrition. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice trembling, "I'm truly sorry. I was wrong. Please, can we start over?" Ava regarded him for a long moment, the cabin holding its collective breath. When she finally spoke, her words were measured and firm. "Apologies are a beginning, not an end," she said. "True change requires reflection, education, and a genuine commitment to do better. I hope you use this experience as an opportunity for growth." With those words, Ava sat back down, effectively ending the conversation. The security officers reached the man's seat, their presence leaving no room for further argument. "Sir," one of them said, "we need you to come with us now." As the man was escorted off the plane, a mix of emotions rippled through the cabin. Some passengers looked relieved, others uncomfortable, and many wore expressions of grim satisfaction. The incident had forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about the persistence of racism and the importance of standing up against it. Emily, the young flight attendant who had been thrust into the center of the confrontation, approached Ava's seat. "Miss Thompson," she said softly, "on behalf of the entire crew, I want to apologize again for what you've experienced. Is there anything we can do to make the rest of your flight more comfortable?" Ava smiled gently at the young woman. "You've already done it," she said, "by standing up for what's right, even when it was difficult. That's all any of us can do." As the plane prepared for takeoff, a new atmosphere settled over the cabin. The shared experience had created a sense of unity among the passengers, a collective acknowledgement of the work still to be done in creating a truly equitable society. And at the center of it all sat Ava Thompson, a woman who had turned a moment of bigotry into an opportunity for change, her quiet strength a beacon for all who witnessed it. The incident on this flight was over, but its ripples would continue to spread, challenging assumptions, sparking conversations, and perhaps, in some small way, moving society forward. As the plane taxied down the runway, the first-class cabin buzzed with a mix of excitement and reflection. The incident that had unfolded moments ago had left an indelible mark on everyone present. Ava Thompson sat quietly in her seat, her book long forgotten as she gazed out the window, lost in thought. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, breaking through the murmur of conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We apologize for the delay in our departure. We want to assure you that the safety and comfort of all our passengers is our top priority. We're now preparing for takeoff. Please fasten your seatbelts and ensure all electronic devices are in airplane mode." As the plane began its ascent, Ava felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find an elderly woman leaning across the aisle, her eyes bright with admiration. "I just wanted to say," the woman whispered, "that you handled that situation with such grace. It's not often we get to see real courage in action." Ava smiled warmly, touched by the woman's words. "Thank you," she replied softly. "Sometimes standing up for what's right is the only option we have." As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dinged off, and a flurry of activity ensued. Passengers began to move about the cabin, many making their way towards Ava's seat. Some offered words of support, while others simply wanted to shake her hand or express their admiration. Emily, the young flight attendant who had been caught in the middle of the earlier confrontation, approached with a tablet in hand. "Miss Thompson," she said, her voice filled with a newfound confidence, "the captain would like to know if you'd be willing to join him in the cockpit for a moment. He'd like to speak with you personally." Ava nodded, rising from her seat to follow Emily. As they made their way to the front of the plane, Ava could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. There was a palpable sense of respect in their gazes, a recognition of the impact her actions had made. The cockpit door opened, revealing the captain and his co-pilot. The captain stood, extending his hand to Ava. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice warm with genuine respect, I want to personally thank you for how you handled that difficult situation. Your composure and strength were truly remarkable." Ava shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate your support and your decisive action." The captain nodded, then hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Miss Thompson, I hope you don't mind, but after what happened, I took the liberty of looking into your background. I have to say, I'm incredibly impressed. Your work in corporate leadership and philanthropy is extraordinary." Ava raised an eyebrow, curious about where this conversation was heading. The captain continued, his voice taking on a note of excitement. "We've been looking for someone like you to join our board of directors. Someone with a fresh perspective who understands the importance of diversity and inclusion in the airline industry. Would you be interested in discussing this further after we land?" The offer caught Ava off guard. She had come onto this flight expecting a routine business trip, and now she was being offered a chance to make a real difference in an industry that clearly needed change. "I'd be honored to discuss it, Captain," she replied, her mind already racing with possibilities. As Ava returned to her seat, she found the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted once again. Word of her conversation with the captain had spread, and now passengers were looking at her with a mix of awe and curiosity. She could hear snippets of conversation, people speculating about who she really was and what her role in the airline might be. A young girl, no more than 10 years old, approached Ava's seat with wide eyes. "Excuse me," she said shyly, "but are you famous?" Ava chuckled softly, shaking her head. "No, sweetie, I'm not famous. I'm just someone who believes in standing up for what's right." The girl's mother, who had followed close behind, smiled apologetically. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, "but my daughter was so impressed by what happened earlier." We both were. It's not often you see someone handle discrimination with such dignity. Ava's expression softened. She leaned in closer to the young girl, her voice gentle but firm. "You know, sometimes the most important thing we can do is to be ourselves, unapologetically. Never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." The girl nodded solemnly, clearly taking Ava's words to heart. As she and her mother returned to their seats, Ava could see the impact of her words rippling through the cabin. Conversations had sprung up all around, parents talking to their children about racism and the importance of standing up against injustice. As the flight progressed, Ava found herself at the center of an impromptu discussion group. Passengers from all walks of life gathered around her seat, eager to share their own experiences and hear her insights. What had started as an ugly incident of discrimination had transformed into a powerful moment of community and education. One passenger, a middle-aged man in a business suit, leaned in with a question. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice tinged with curiosity, "you mentioned being an investor in the airline. Can you tell us more about that? How did you come to be in that position?" Ava paused, considering her words carefully. She was usually private about her business dealings, but she recognized the importance of this moment. "Well," she began, "it's a long story, but the short version is this. I started my career as a junior analyst at a small investment firm. I worked hard, faced a lot of challenges, but I never gave up. Eventually, I founded my own company, focusing on socially responsible investments." She paused, gauging the reactions of those around her. The passengers hung on her every word, clearly captivated by her story. "One of our key principles," Ava continued, "is investing in companies that are committed to diversity and positive social change. When I saw an opportunity to invest in this airline, I saw it as a chance to push for more inclusive practices in the travel industry." A wave of understanding swept through the group. Ava's presence on this flight, her handling of the earlier confrontation, and now this revelation about her role as an investor, it all painted a picture of a woman dedicated to creating change from within the system. As the plane began its descent, the impact of the day's events was palpable. Passengers exchanged contact information, promising to stay in touch and continue the conversations that had begun on this flight. Many approached Ava one last time, thanking her for her courage and inspiration. Emily, the flight attendant, made her way down the aisle, preparing the cabin for landing. She paused at Ava's seat, a look of determination on her face. "Miss Thompson," she said, her voice steady, I want you to know that what happened today has inspired me. I'm going to speak with my supervisors about implementing better training programs for dealing with discrimination on our flights." Ava smiled warmly at the young woman. "That's wonderful, Emily. Remember, change often starts with one person willing to speak up." As the plane touched down, Ava felt a sense of accomplishment that went far beyond any business deal she had originally come to close. She had turned a moment of bigotry into an opportunity for education and growth. And now, with the possibility of a board position, she had a chance to create lasting change in an entire industry. The seatbelt sign dinged off for the final time, and passengers began to gather their belongings. But there was a difference in the air, a sense of connection and purpose that hadn't existed when they first boarded. As Ava stood to retrieve her bag from the overhead compartment, she knew that the ripples from this flight would continue long after they had all gone their separate ways. What had started as a routine business trip had become something much more significant, a moment of transformation, not just for Ava, but for everyone who had witnessed her courage and grace under pressure. As she prepared to disembark, Ava felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey ahead was long, but she was ready for the challenge. As the plane taxied to the gate, Richard Stevens sat in a small, windowless room in the airport security office, his head in his hands. The weight of his actions bore down on him, each passing minute a stark reminder of how quickly his world had unraveled. Just hours ago, he had been a respected businessman, accustomed to the privileges that came with his position and status. Now, he was a pariah, his name and face soon to be plastered across social media as the embodiment of entrenched racism and privilege. The door opened, and a stern-faced airport security officer entered, followed by two airline representatives. Richard looked up, a flicker of hope crossing his face. Perhaps this was all a misunderstanding. Perhaps he could still salvage the situation. "Mr. Stevens," the security officer began, his voice devoid of sympathy, "we've reviewed the incident report from the flight crew, as well as multiple witness statements and video recordings from passengers. The airline has made the decision to ban you from future travel on any of their flights or partner airlines." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to protest, but the airline representative, a woman with a crisp suit and an unwavering gaze, cut him off. "Mr. Stevens, your behavior was not only discriminatory but created a hostile environment for other passengers. We have a zero-tolerance policy for such actions." Richard's mind raced, grasping for some way to undo the damage. "Please," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I made a mistake. I'll apologize publicly. I'll take sensitivity training. Anything." The second airline representative, a younger man with a tablet in hand, spoke up. "Mr. Stevens, I'm afraid the decision is final. However, there is another matter we need to discuss." He tapped on his tablet, bringing up a document. "Our records show that you're scheduled to deliver a keynote speech at the International Business Leadership Conference next week. Given the circumstances, the conference organizers have asked us to inform you that your invitation has been rescinded." The news hit Richard like a tidal wave. The conference was supposed to be the crowning achievement of his career, a platform to solidify his status as a thought leader in the business world. Now it was slipping away, along with everything else he had taken for granted. "No," he whispered, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. "You don't understand. That speech, it was going to be my legacy. I've spent months preparing. Please, there must be something I can do." The airline representatives exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of pity and resolve. The woman spoke again, her voice firm but not unkind. "Mr. Stevens, I'm afraid the repercussions of your actions extend beyond just this incident. The video of your behavior has already gone viral on social media. #FirstClassRacist is trending nationwide." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as he unlocked the screen. Notifications flooded in, missed calls, text messages, emails. He opened his social media app, and his worst fears were confirmed. The video was everywhere, shared thousands of times, with comments ranging from outrage to calls for his resignation from his company. As he scrolled through the feed, He saw a statement from his own company appearing at the top of his timeline. His heart sank as he read the words, "We are aware of the incident involving one of our executives. We want to make it clear that his actions do not reflect the values of our organization. We are conducting an internal investigation and will take appropriate action." The security officer cleared his throat, drawing Richard's attention back to the room. "Mr. Stevens, we need to discuss the legal implications of your actions. The airline is considering pressing charges for disorderly conduct and causing a disturbance on an aircraft. Additionally, Ms. Thompson has the right to pursue civil action against you for discrimination." The mention of Ava Thompson's name sent another wave of shame and regret through Richard. The image of her standing tall, dignified in the face of his bigotry, was seared into his memory. He had underestimated her so completely, had let his prejudices blind him to her true worth and power. Now, she held his fate in her hands. What do I do now?" Richard asked, his voice small and uncertain. The younger airline representative spoke up, his tone professional, but with a hint of compassion. "Mr. Stevens, I would strongly advise you to seek legal counsel immediately. You should also consider issuing a public apology, though I must warn you that at this point, it may do little to mitigate the damage to your reputation." Richard nodded numbly, the full weight of his actions finally settling on his shoulders. He thought about his family, his colleagues, his friends. How would he face them after this? How could he explain to his children that their father had become the face of racism in America overnight? As if reading his thoughts, the security officer spoke again. "Mr. Stevens, we've arranged for a private exit from the airport to avoid any incidents with the press or public. There's a car waiting for you at a secure location. I suggest you use this time to contact your family and prepare them for what's coming." Richard stood on shaky legs, gathering his belongings. As he was escorted through the back corridors of the airport, he felt like a shadow of his former self. The confident, entitled businessman who had boarded the plane earlier that day was gone, replaced by a man grappling with the consequences of his deepest flaws laid bare for the world to see. As he settled into the back seat of the waiting car, Richard's phone buzzed with a new notification. It was an email from his company's HR department, requesting his presence at an emergency board meeting the following morning. The subject line read, "Disciplinary action and company image." The car pulled away from the airport, carrying Richard towards an uncertain future. As the city lights blurred past the window, he closed his eyes, the gravity of his situation overwhelming him. He had started this day believing he was untouchable, that his status and wealth shielded him from consequences. Now, he was facing the harsh reality that in the court of public opinion, redemption would be a long and difficult road. Back at the airport, Ava Thompson emerged from the plane, greeted by a small crowd of admirers who had heard about the incident. As she made her way through the terminal, people stopped to shake her hand, to thank her for standing up against discrimination. She handled the attention with grace, but her mind was already racing with the possibilities that lay ahead. The captain's offer of a board position was more than just a job opportunity. It was a chance to create real, systemic change in an industry that desperately needed it. As she reached the exit, Ava found herself surrounded by a group of reporters, their cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. "Miss Thompson, can you comment on the incident aboard your flight today? How do you feel about the airline's response to the situation? What message do you have for others who face discrimination while traveling?" Ava paused, considering her words carefully. This was more than just a statement. It was an opportunity to shape the narrative, to turn this incident into a catalyst for change. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice clear and confident. "What happened today is unfortunately not unique. Many people face discrimination and prejudice while simply trying to go about their lives. But what is unique is how swiftly and decisively action was taken. I commend the airline staff and my fellow passengers for standing up against bigotry." She paused, making eye contact with each reporter in turn. This incident serves as a reminder that we all have a responsibility to create a more inclusive society. It's not enough to be non-racist. We must be actively anti-racist. To those who face discrimination, I say, stand tall, know your worth, and never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. As Ava finished her impromptu press conference and made her way to her waiting car, she felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The day had been a whirlwind of emotions and confrontations, but it had also opened up new possibilities. She had boarded that plane as a successful businesswoman and disembarked as a symbol of resilience and a voice for change. In the coming days and weeks, both Ava and Richard would find their lives irrevocably altered by the events of that flight. For Richard, it would be a long journey of self-reflection, public scrutiny, and attempts at redemption. For Ava, it would be a platform to push for greater diversity and inclusion, not just in the airline industry, but in corporate America as a whole. As night fell on the city, two very different futures were unfolding. One of a man facing the consequences of his prejudices, and another of a woman rising to meet the challenge of creating lasting change. The incident on Flight 1143 may have lasted only a few minutes, but its impact would be felt for years to come, a stark reminder of the power of standing up for what's right, even in the face of adversity. In the weeks following the incident on Flight 1143, the story of Ava Thompson and Richard Stevens became a national talking point. It sparked conversations about race, privilege, and accountability in boardrooms, classrooms, and dinner tables across the country. The viral video of their confrontation had become a catalyst for a broader discussion about systemic racism and its manifestations in everyday life. Ava Thompson found herself thrust into the spotlight, a role she embraced with characteristic grace and determination. Her impromptu press conference at the airport had been just the beginning. Talk show invitations flooded in, each one an opportunity to share her story and advocate for change. On a sunny Tuesday morning, Ava sat in the green room of a popular morning show, preparing for her interview. As she reviewed her talking points, she reflected on the whirlwind of the past month. The airline had made good on the captain's offer, appointing her to their board of directors with a specific mandate to oversee diversity and inclusion initiatives. Ms. Thompson, a young production assistant, poked her head into the room. "You're on in 5 minutes." Ava nodded, standing to smooth out her dress. As she walked towards the studio, she could hear the host introducing her segment. "Up next, we have a special guest. Ava Thompson, the woman at the center of the now infamous first-class incident, joins us to discuss her new role in shaping airline policy and her vision for a more inclusive future in travel and beyond." As Ava took her seat under the bright studio lights, she felt a sense of purpose. This was more than just an interview. It was an opportunity to push the conversation forward, to transform a moment of confrontation into a movement for change. "Ava, thank you for joining us," the host began. "It's been a month since the incident that thrust you into the national spotlight. How has your life changed since then?" Ava smiled, her poise evident even under the pressure of live television. "It's been quite a journey," she began. "But what's most important is not how my life has changed, but how we can use this moment to create lasting change in our society." As the interview progressed, Ava deftly steered the conversation beyond the specifics of the incident to the broader issues at play. She spoke about the subtle and not-so-subtle ways that racism manifests in daily life, the importance of corporate responsibility in fostering inclusive environments, and her vision for a future where incidents like hers would be the exception, not the rule. Meanwhile, across town, Richard Stevens sat in his home office, watching Ava's interview with a mixture of shame and grudging admiration. The past month had been a humbling experience for him. He had lost his job, his speaking engagements had dried up, and his social circle had shrunk considerably as friends and colleagues distanced themselves from the controversy. But as he listened to Ava speak about the need for education and self-reflection, Richard felt something shift within him. The anger and defensiveness that had initially consumed him in the wake of the incident had gradually given way to a painful but necessary process of self-examination. He turned to his computer, where a half-finished blog post sat open, titled "My Journey of Unlearning: Confronting My Own Racism." It was Richard's attempt to publicly reckon with his actions and the beliefs that had led to them. Writing it had been an agonizing process, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and the society that had shaped him. As Ava's interview concluded, Richard took a deep breath and began to type again. He knew that this public mea culpa wouldn't undo the harm he had caused or instantly rehabilitate his image. But it felt like a necessary step, not just for his own redemption, but as part of a larger conversation that Ava had started. Months passed, and the ripple effects of the incident continued to spread. Ava's appointment to the airline's board had sparked a trend, with other companies scrambling to diversify their leadership and implement more robust anti-discrimination policies. The hashtag first-class equality had evolved from a reaction to a single incident to a movement pushing for systemic change in the travel industry and beyond. Ava found herself at the forefront of this movement, balancing her new responsibilities at the airline with speaking engagements and advisory roles. She had become a respected voice in discussions about corporate diversity and inclusion, her experience serving as both a cautionary tale and a call to action. 1 year after the incident, Ava stood at a podium in a packed auditorium, preparing to deliver the keynote address at the very same International Business Leadership Conference that had rescinded Richard's invitation. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her, but she saw it as a testament to how much could change in a year. As she began her speech, Ava noticed a familiar face in the audience. Richard Stevens sat in the back row, his posture a far cry from the entitled businessman who had confronted her on the plane. He had reached out to Ava months earlier, asking to meet and apologize in person. While initially hesitant, Ava had agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to turn an adversary into an ally in the fight against discrimination. Their meeting had been tense but productive. Richard had spoken about his journey of self-reflection and the work he had done to educate himself and confront his biases. Ava had listened, offered her perspective, and ultimately extended an invitation for Richard to attend her keynote speech. Now, as Ava addressed the audience of business leaders, she spoke about the power of transformative moments and the importance of using privilege and position to create positive change. She shared her vision of a corporate world where diversity was not just a buzzword, but a fundamental value, where incidents like hers would be met with swift action and serve as learning opportunities. As she concluded her speech to a standing ovation, Ava felt a sense of both accomplishment and responsibility. The incident on Flight 1143 had been a pivotal moment, not just in her life, but in the ongoing struggle for equality and respect. It had shown both the persistent reality of racism and the power of standing up against it. In the lobby after the speech, Ava found herself face to face with Richard once again. The tension between them was still palpable, a reminder of how deep the wounds of discrimination can run. But there was also a sense of cautious hope, a shared recognition that change, while difficult, was possible. "Thank you for inviting me," Richard said, his voice quiet but sincere. "Your speech, it gave me a lot to think about." Ava nodded, her expression serious, but not unkind. "The work of unlearning and changing is never easy," she said. "But it's necessary. For all of us." As they parted ways, Ava felt the weight of the journey she had embarked on. The incident on Flight 1143 had been just the beginning. The real work of changing minds, reforming systems, and building a more equitable society was ongoing. But as she looked around at the diverse group of business leaders engaged in earnest discussions about inclusion and equality, Ava felt a surge of optimism. One flight, one confrontation, one moment of standing up for what was right had set off a chain reaction. It wasn't the end of racism or discrimination, but it was a step forward, a reminder that change was possible, one person, one policy, one day at a time. As Ava left the conference center, she felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that each one was an opportunity to push for progress and create a world where everyone could truly belong.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.